This modern sneaker can lace itself automatically, track your stride, and adjust its cushioning in real time. For most of the time, our species has existed. Nothing stood between a barefoot and the raw earth. The human foot holds 26 bones and over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, all working together. That grip mattered enormously, and across every climate on Earth, people solved the exact same problem differently. This isn't the story of one single invention. It's several, born oceans apart, that never once copied each other. Every one of those old solutions still echoes somewhere inside the very shoe on your foot right now. To really understand any of them, you first have to understand exactly what they were all trying to protect. Some of the very oldest footprints ever preserved on Earth belong to people who wore nothing at all. Even today, a small but genuinely devoted community insists the barefoot was never really the problem. A desert, a mountain village, a dense jungle, a frozen ice field, and a distant royal court. Every single one of those stories starts the exact same way, with someone deciding bare skin wasn't enough. In a remote canyon deep in the Judean desert, a burial cave sat completely untouched for 6,000 years. Inside, researchers finally found a woven mat, a bow, a wooden bowl, and a pair of leather sandals. The bone-dry desert air had done what almost nowhere else on Earth could: preserved leather for millennia. These weren't decorative in the slightest, just simple leather soles and straps, built for crossing rock and scrub. Whoever wore them once crossed one of the harshest landscapes on the planet, completely unrecorded and unnamed. It's one of the oldest known shoes ever built specifically to survive a desert, not just cover a foot. A wooden bow and a carved bowl sat buried right beside him, hinting at his standing in the group. Careful radiocarbon testing dated the sandals to roughly 4,000 years before any Egyptian pyramid was built. That single detail quietly rewrote what historians had assumed about early, pre-civilization footwear technology. It wasn't luck alone. Rare desert heat, extremely low humidity, and undisturbed rock preserved everything almost perfectly. Even 6,000 years ago, a torn strap wasn't the end of a shoe, just something to mend by firelight. That same fragile sandal now rests safely behind climate-controlled glass inside a modern museum display. In China, one particular style of shoe grew so small it required a foot reshaped since early childhood. These delicate lotus shoes were tiny, silk, and heavily embroidered, some barely 4 inches long from heel to toe. The practice behind them, known as foot binding, began around the Song dynasty and lasted roughly 1,000 years. A small, narrow foot was seen as elegant and marriageable, so shoemakers built an entire craft around dressing it. By the late 19th century, entire workshops across Chinese cities specialized in nothing but this one style of shoe. Every workshop developed its own signature embroidery stitch, and skilled artisans became known by name in their neighborhoods. Owning a truly beautifully made pair was as much a mark of status as it was of fashion. Foot binding was formally banned in the early 20th century, though the practice lingered in rural areas for decades. An entire generation grew up caught between two very different competing ideas of what a proper shoe should look like. Today, surviving lotus shoes sit quietly in museums, reminders of how far a shoe can go to reshape a body. In Japan, ordinary people wore something almost entirely different: simple sandals braided from rice straw, called huarache. Farmers made their own straw sandals and could weave a fresh, working pair in well under an hour. Huarache were cheap, light, and completely disposable, worn by farmers, travelers, and even samurai on long, hard marches. Because they wore out so quickly, soldiers on long campaigns carried extra pairs strapped to their packs as standard gear. Pilgrims walking to distant shrines sometimes carried spare pairs strung over their shoulders for the entire journey. Over time, A flatter, simpler cousin called zori emerged, worn with kimono, for ordinary, everyday city life. Wooden getter sandals rose up instead on tall platforms, built specifically to clear mud and rain in old towns. Nearly every household could weave its own supply, which meant footwear rarely had to be bought at all. The simple act of removing your shoes at the door became its own quiet, deeply ingrained ritual of respect. A small number of dedicated artisans still weave huarache entirely by hand today, keeping an ancient technique alive. You can trace a fairly direct line from these straw sandals to the split-toe work boots worn today. Across the ocean, in Mesoamerica, a completely unrelated style of sandal was independently taking shape, the huarache. The word itself comes from a Purépecha term, and the design wove thin leather strips tightly over a flat sole. Commoners, warriors, and merchants all wore some version, though finer materials and dyes clearly marked higher status. Finely made sandals sometimes appeared as part of the tribute owed to rulers, right alongside cloth and cacao beans. The open woven design let air move freely through the shoe, which mattered enormously in the jungle heat. Dyed leather and much tighter weaves distinguished ceremonial pairs from the plain sandals worn for everyday farm work. The flat sole itself was cut from a single piece of tanned hide, carefully shaped to the wearer's own foot. Unlike most ancient footwear on this list, the huarache never actually disappeared. It's still handmade across Mexico today. Even now, a torn strap simply gets rewoven rather than thrown away entirely, the same instinct that outlasted empires. This exact weaving technique has been passed down, hand to hand, for far longer than most written records exist. At the opposite extreme of climate, in the Arctic, footwear had to solve a completely different problem entirely. Inuit seamstresses built tall boots called kamit from sealskin, using waterproofing techniques passed down through many generations. The stitching itself was carefully engineered, a specific waterproof seam that never fully punctured all the way through the hide. Caribou fur lined the inside for warmth, while the sealskin exterior kept meltwater and slush from ever soaking through. Making enough boots for a full hunting season was often a genuinely shared effort among several seamstresses working together. Without this precise stitching technology, hunting out on sea ice for weeks at a time would have been impossible. That exact same waterproof stitch is still taught and used today, remarkably unchanged after all these centuries. A single failed stitch could mean frostbite just hours later, so every seam was carefully checked and rechecked before use. Patterns for building a genuinely good boot were treated as family knowledge, remembered rather than ever written down. Modern outdoor gear designers have studied this exact stitch directly, borrowing its logic for cold weather boots today. Communities across the Arctic still make and wear kamik today, not as a museum piece, but as daily clothing. In Mughal India, footwear worn at court turned into a canvas for some of the region's very finest embroidery. These ornate shoes, called mojari or juti, were stitched by hand with gold thread, tiny mirrors, and colored silk. Before a single stitch of embroidery even began, the leather itself was dyed and carefully cured for days. Leather was chosen specifically for its flexibility, since these shoes had no left or right, built to fit either foot. Entire market districts in cities like Jodhpur and Lucknow gradually grew up around this one single, specialized craft. The distinctive curled toe wasn't purely decorative. It also kept the front of the shoe from dragging through dust. The sheer richness of a courtier's embroidery often signaled their rank almost as clearly as their robes did. The craft never really left India at all. Artisans across the country still hand-stitch mohari using centuries-old techniques. Today, a finely embroidered pair is still considered an essential, almost non-negotiable part of formal wedding dress. Contemporary designers now regularly reinterpret the mojari for global fashion runways, without ever letting go of the original craft. Some surviving pairs are genuinely centuries old, preserved not for their durability, but for the artistry stitched into them. On the North American plains, a very different kind of shoe grew out of an entirely different set of needs. Soft-soled moccasins were built from carefully brain-tanned hide, worked for hours until supple enough to fold like cloth. Unlike a stiff, hard-soled sandal, the moccasin was specifically built to move naturally with the foot, not against it. Beadwork turned each finished pair into something deeply personal, with patterns that could identify a wearer's family or community. Beadwork patterns and specific techniques were often generously shared and traded between neighboring families across the plains. Some intricate patterns took days of careful, repetitive stitching to fully complete before a single pair was ever worn. A child's very first pair was often treated as its own small ceremony, marking their first real steps forward. The soft, flexible sole had a real practical advantage too, moving almost silently across dry grass and brush. That same beadwork tradition is still very much alive today, worn with genuine pride at gatherings across the continent. Modern museum conservators today treat surviving pairs with the same careful attention as any fine work of art. Each surviving pair still carries its own signature, a distinct pattern language that outsiders never fully learned to read. In the wet, low-lying fields of the Netherlands, farmers needed something plain leather could simply never survive: solid wood. Klompen were carved from a single solid block of poplar or willow, light woods that floated rather than rotted. A genuinely skilled clog maker could shape the outside by hand, then hollow the inside on a simple lathe. The finished wood was completely waterproof, shrugging off mud and standing water that would soak straight through leather. Plain, unpainted pairs were the standard for daily fieldwork, cheap enough that most families kept several pairs on hand. For special occasions, brightly painted and carved patterns turned an ordinary working shoe into something closer to folk art. Regional workshops each developed their own signature carving patterns, almost like a maker's personal signature stamped into wood. By the 19th century, entire Dutch villages had built their local economy almost entirely around clog production. Steam-powered machinery eventually took over the roughest shaping work, though careful finishing was still often done by hand. Wooden clogs proved so resistant to punctures and impact that some factory workers still wear reinforced versions today. In a small handful of Dutch villages today, the trade survives mostly as tourism and demonstration rather than necessity. Even now, some farmers still reach for solid wood over rubber boots when the fields turn to mud. What began as purely practical fieldwork gear ended up becoming one of the most recognizable shoes in the entire world. High in the Andes, an entirely different kind of sandal had to survive altitude, cold nights, and steep terrain. Andean sandals, known today as ojotas, were often built from tough, durable llama or alpaca hide. The vast Inca road network stretched for thousands of miles, and its messengers depended entirely on durable footwear. These relay runners, known as chasqui, could carry urgent messages across the entire empire remarkably fast on foot. In some higher regions, tough plant fibers replaced leather entirely, especially where livestock were genuinely scarce. Markets scattered across the Andes today still sell versions of this exact same basic design, largely unchanged. A thin, flexible sole let the foot feel and constantly adjust to loose or uneven mountain rock underfoot. Herders moving livestock across the high plateau wore essentially the same basic sandal for generation after generation. In the 20th century, worn-out rubber tires became a common material, far tougher and more available than tanned hide. The eventual switch to rubber didn't really change the design at all, just extended its working life considerably. At local festivals, this humble sandal sometimes gets dressed up with bright wool pom-poms and colorful woven trim. Walk the old Inca trails today, and you'll still find local guides wearing some version of that same sandal. Very few shoes anywhere have stayed this recognizable for this long, across empires, colonization, and modern industry alike. By the 18th century, one single English town had turned shoemaking into an entire regional identity, Northampton. Guilds carefully organized the trade street by street, with apprentices training for years before earning the title of master. Finishing an apprenticeship was almost like a rite of passage, marked with its own ceremony in the guild hall. During wartime, Northampton alone supplied enormous quantities of boots to entire armies, all still stitched largely by hand. One particular step resisted mechanization far longer than any other. Lasting, stretching leather tightly over the shoe's wooden form. An ocean away, in a Massachusetts factory, a young immigrant named Jan Ernst Matzeliger noticed that exact same bottleneck. He watched an older worker slowly hand-pull leather over a wooden form, hammering in nails, one by one. Working alone after his shifts, he spent years building rough prototypes from scrap wood, wire, and old cigar boxes. Co-workers who saw the strange wooden contraption openly laughed at what looked like an entirely hopeless project. Even the skeptics eventually agreed to watch his finished iron machine go through one careful public demonstration. In 1883, he was finally granted a patent for an automated lasting machine that reshaped the industry within a decade. His remarkable machine could turn out up to 700 pairs a day, compared with roughly 50 by hand. Shoe prices fell by nearly half almost overnight, finally making sturdy leather shoes affordable for ordinary working families. Not everyone welcomed the machine. Skilled handlasters worried correctly that their entire craft was about to change forever. Within just a decade, machines built on his exact design reached factories all the way back in Northampton. Within a single generation, a skill passed down carefully for centuries had shifted entirely from human hands to iron. He died young, sadly, long before he ever saw how completely his invention reshaped the industry he had joined. A desert sandal, a silk shoe, a straw sandal, a huarache, and a beaded moccasin laid out side by side. None of these cultures ever once spoke to each other, yet each independently solved lasting and waterproofing on its own. Every single modern shoe still carries traces of that convergence, faint echoes of desert leather and Arctic stitching. Today's tools are entirely digital, but the underlying goal really hasn't changed in roughly 6,000 years. We can now map a foot down to the millimeter, a genuine luxury no ancient cobbler ever had access to. And yet today's actual range of solutions isn't so different from what existed on Earth thousands of years ago. We rarely think about any of this at all. We just reach for the pair by the door and go. But every single step is still solving the same problem someone once solved entirely, patiently, by hand. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is still making shoes almost exactly the way their ancestors once did. In any single crowd today, you can genuinely still see nearly every solution this whole story ever produced. Some of these very old designs never actually lost the argument, especially out on rough, uneven terrain. And in certain trades even today, solid wood still quietly outperforms almost anything synthetic that's replaced it. Different climates, different materials, different centuries, and somehow, again and again, the exact same idea kept reappearing. Put them all together in one room, and you're not really looking at fashion history at all. You're looking instead at engineering history, quietly refined independently, again and again, across the entire world. Every single one of these ancient crafts still has someone, somewhere, keeping it genuinely alive by hand today. Protect what carries you, and it will carry you much further than you ever really expected it to. 7 very different places, 7 very different solutions, and one old, deeply human instinct connecting every single one. The distance between them is thousands of years, yet the underlying purpose behind them never really changed at all. Thanks so much for exploring this hidden history with us today.